Next up, we're in for a real treat. We're ready to hear from someone who's led their publicly listed company through a multi-state compliance crisis, and she's going to share what other organizations can learn from her experience. Donna Bucella is the current president of compliance at Guidepost Solutions. She's formerly the chief compliance officer at Education Management Corporation. Donna has held numerous leadership positions at government agencies, including the DOJ, Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense. Very impressive. Please welcome to the stage, Donna Bucella.
Green means go. Good afternoon, everyone. Please, I hope you had M&Ms and coffee so you're not sleeping. It's great to be here. I'll talk a little bit about Education Management Corporation, but I really need to give you just some highlights of some of the opportunities I've had, and you can obviously see I like to go into Mission Impossible. After the Oklahoma City bombing, I was the first on the ground. I didn't know what we were going to find, but I had to set up a team to investigate. After 9/11, someone asked me if I'd be willing, Bob Mueller, to set up the Terrorist Screening Center, the first place where the United States government would keep all of the names of known and suspected terrorists in one watch list, still in existence today. And then I left Customs in Intel, and I was asked to work at Education Management Corporation. I went into the company full well knowing that there were a number of False Claims Act. I didn't know the exact number. There was more than likely a key TAM, and that the state AGs were knocking on our door. 12, initially 44 signed off on our agreement. So I'm going to just tell you one thing about compliance. Compliance drives operations. Good compliance drives operation. Bad compliance will take a company to its knees and out of business. And you can see that the Department of Justice and every regulatory agency has their snap on who has a good compliance program and who doesn't. Look at that, $4.7 billion in False Claims Act cases. 2.48 in FCPA, and then customs fraud violation, 50 million. Every industry is a subject of oversight. And I worked in the Department of Justice, so I clearly understand that, for example, in education, if we were going to get hit by the state AGs and the Department of Justice, then the CFPB would be going after one of our competitors, and the FTC would go after another competitor, and the Securities and Exchange Commission would go after another competitor. There was plenty to go around, and they all take turns on it because, guess what? It's a profitable business. There were a couple things I learned at Education Management Corporation, but actually throughout any industry that I do. I work at Guidepost Solutions, and we provide guidance to people that are working in highly regulated agencies. I refer to us as the Sherpa through government regulations. Many of the people that I work with, my colleagues, we were former prosecutors, former heads of agencies, former agents. Many of us, unfortunately or fortunately, didn't really like the practice of law in a law firm, but we like helping people get through problems. And our whole dynamic is, we will get you through this, because we've been on the other side and we sort of know what the regulators are looking at. But first and foremost, I do have to say that these are sort of trying to figure out navigating a crisis. As I said, I went into Education Management Corporation. The compliance department was one person buried in the legal department. Before I accepted the job, I made sure that my CEO knew that I had to report to the chairman of the board. I could report through him, but that was the only way I would accept the job. And that business model, and I don't know for many of you in your companies if you have compliance is in legal or compliance is separate. It really doesn't matter as long as your company puts the right resources on the compliance end. But in my company, when I went in, I said, this is not just about compliance, this is about a culture. And, LaSalle talked about the culture. And I can tell you this, for many companies that we at Guidepost are monitors on, it's really not about the numbers, it's always about the culture. Volkswagen, the culture. UBS, the culture. Tenet Healthcare, the culture. And it is so important to make sure that you actually have a game plan. And compliance isn't just about compliance. And I know, because as a compliance officer, they all looked at me too. Oh my God, here she comes. But I have to tell you that what I asked my CEO to do and then what he ultimately did, at one point, I swear to God, I thought the whole company was in compliance. I would move in a group. Marketing came first, and that's exactly how I met PerformLine. I didn't know how we got students when I first went in. Frankly, I didn't really know that much about the for-profit education industry. It was an industry that was operating. Frankly, it wasn't really being regulated by the regulators at the time. Somebody finally woke up and said, oh my God, this is federal funding, and how are they bringing the students in? And one of them is through the call center. And being from having the Intel background, I was saying we must have data around. Let me listen to some calls. And then I went into my call center, and there I'm listening and watching people listening to 45 minutes of one call. Every time I sat down to listen to one, I heard stuff that I just could not believe. As a former federal prosecutor who prosecuted boiler rooms, I just went wild. And finally, thank God, PerformLine, they could do voice analytics. And they were able to queue up the calls so that my staff that just sat there listening to 45 minutes of calls, of one call, could listen to multiple calls. That was unbelievable. And then I realized that in order to make compliance easy for everybody, the thing that you really needed to make sure you did was make it easy for them. Figure out what information, what data you needed to be as automated as possible. And once you did that, then you could actually show people the data, because nobody's ever going to believe it. And frankly, the stuff that we see in the compliance field and the stuff that we see in the regulatory field, you can't make up these examples. I'm not that creative. Nobody's that creative. I mean, people do stupid things. But companies don't start out thinking in the morning that the employees are going to say, how can I screw our company this time? That's just not how it happens. What happens is people get lax, there's a lack of supervision, and then creativity starts happening. I just never understood why people get creative if they didn't just do stuff the right way. So let me talk a little bit about sort of the steps here. And really the only thing you need to know, and after this, if you get these materials, just take the pre-planning and take that piece of paper and put it somewhere on your desk, because that is what everybody needs to do from the beginning. Unfortunately, everybody pre-plans after the crisis. The board. My board was a very active board. My head of my board was from Heinz, and my head of my audit committee was from Delta. I have to tell you, as a lawyer, when I went before that board, I felt like I was back in law school again with the Socratic method. I didn't have much time to talk, but whatever it was, if I identified a problem, I better have a way to fix it. And I better tell them how I was going to fix it, when it was going to get fixed, and who was going to be involved. Communication. I don't know why when companies have problems, they try to put it under the rug. Tell your employees. First of all, it's not a gotcha. But you have to know that, hey, we are in trouble, but let us tell you how we are going to fix it. Everybody in the company, if this is the company that they want to be part of, if they want to be proud of, they've got to be part of compliance. And then you got to have a plan. And let me tell you, I'll tell you a little bit about when I got there. Everybody always says, we're about to settle. Oh, it's like a big thing. We're about to settle. And then what's going to happen? Then we'll write a check. Oh, that's great. If you have a problem, you have to address it. I knew going in that we were going to have about 2 years or more before we would actually sign, seal, and deliver and get the matter behind us. I'm working with a company right now where we're there proactively, we're there before the monitors, because one thing that happens with a company, if you have problems, and all companies do, if any of you work for a company that doesn't, please let me know, I'll give you my resume. Every company has problems, and everybody, the opportunity for you to get in trouble is because you have problems, you have some policies that nobody even knows what they are, they just kind of ignore them if you even have policies, and there's no way of testing, there's no way of judging, there's no way of auditing what it is that you're doing. And what you have to do, and what we realized was time was of the essence. There was an immediate sense of urgency. I mean, I brought the marketing people, they became part of my staff. I had operators part of my staff. We had 4 different schools, they were part of my staff. I pulled from everywhere, and then working with our chief legal officer, we had work streams. Every single day, at least 1 or 2 hours was dedicated to fixing something or coming up with a strategy. If it meant scripts as to what students were going to say on the phone or not, training materials, were they updated, were they used, were they audited, were they trackable? What were the other issues that we had to do, that we had to change? Were we following our policies and procedures? Did anybody even in the company own the policy and procedure? We used to call it one throat to choke. So don't sit there and say, oh, yeah, that's legal's issue. Oh, don't worry about it, that's marketing's issue. Who is it? And it didn't necessarily have to be the head of that business unit. It could be somebody next line down. It didn't matter, but everybody was responsible for something. We made it so that everybody in the company was engaged. And if they weren't, and I know trying to change the culture is very important, and it's nice to get everybody doing the kumbaya, but I got to tell you, sometimes a couple just had to go. And fortunately, when I had the data, and someone was on the phone, and I had heard them say something really bad because somebody called me and said, I want you to hear what this person just said. I said, no, they couldn't have said that. Yeah, they did. And literally, I'd call up my head of the call center. I'd say, go over and take that person and bring them over to me. And then I'd get legal and HR, and off they would go. It was a little public, but look, we were in trouble, and the whole industry was in trouble, but we knew that we had the light on us and the gun to our head, and we had to take this very seriously. And then we decided to have a plan. Can't fix everything overnight, but whatever it was, we had a plan. And then when problems happen, and they will always happen, how do you prevent them from happening again? Because that's exactly what my board always wanted to know. How did this happen, and what did you do to fix it? And how is it never going to happen again? Well, I can never promise that. So this is the important slide. You never prepare for a crisis in a crisis. Unfortunately, 90% of everybody prepares for a crisis in a crisis. You need to anticipate what kind of problems we're going to possibly have. People are going to, violate the statutes, they're going to violate regulations, they're going to violate policies. But what I found, and what I see in every company, and I work for the Bank of America, trust me, I've worked for a lot of companies, and everybody wants to be proud of their brand. And it's horrible to go to work when people are not proud of their brand, and that's the reputational issue. Sometimes it's not a legal issue. Sometimes nobody violated the law, but they just did something really stupid, like we saw before with the Twin Towers. Those are just very, very stupid things. And you can't, when you're hiring people, you can't ask them the judgment question. I don't know what the judgment question is. God knows during interviews I try to find out people's judgment. I try to test them all the time, but I'm not that successful at it. But then we just needed to make sure that we had a well-defined process of how we were going to fix what we had. I told you about a board. I knew about my board. They all talked to one another. They had friends in the company that they would get information from, so my key was make sure I knew the information before they did. And even more important, the hotline. I can't tell you. Any company I've ever gone into, and I'm looking at compliance, I've gone into financial institutions, I ask for the hotline complaints. It's always in there. It's in there, and it was for my company. It was in there for years, and I don't know. I guess people thought, oh, that's nice. We have one of those. That's your checklist compliance program, and then figuring out how do you escalate something and who do you escalate it to. I mean, look, the sky is always falling in, but as a chief compliance officer, you cannot have that attitude because you should be out. Your thing is, I need to know what needs to be done and how to fix it, and then when to escalate the issues. Communication, make sure your staff knows what's going on. One of the things that we had is every time we were getting to another part of the agreement that was public, we had to tell our staff. Now, we didn't tell them way before because we were publicly traded and that could have been a problem, but we told them as it was happening. So when we knew that the news was going to get the story, boom, everybody got something. Right after that, we would have our CEO do an all-hands meeting around the company, videoed all around the United States, to talk about what was happening and what was going to, how it was going to impact them. That helped. It didn't fix it. But really, there really needs to be transparency and communication. Executing the plan, trying to figure out when to do something, how to make it happen, how to be organized so you have a plan and your employees know that there's a strategy. Might not be perfect, but at least if you can communicate that. And then prevention, trying to figure out what the root causes are and trying to make sure that you fix it. One of the things that hurt us in the company was we knew that there were problems in the company for years, and DOJ was sniffing around, and nobody really did anything about it immediately. As soon as you know that regulators are looking at you, not that you have to be scared about it, tackle it head on, address it. The best thing that helped us during that 2-year period where we were doing our settlement, I kept notebooks. I know it's old-fashioned, but I went from our code of conduct, how we improved the code of conduct, how the training was executed, how the test questions were changed, and then I had an audit trail of everybody's training. We also had all of our policies and procedures. How are we recruiting? How are we using lead vendors? How are we monitoring all of the call centers? I was able to show that. So when we got to the settlement days and they said, okay, here's your monitor, who I happen to know, I couldn't have picked a better guy. He looked at me and smiled and he said, you got your notebooks? He knew me. And I have to tell you, if you show when you finally get to the final settlement, you bring in all of your improvements. That will take some zeros off of the settlement agreement. Your company and your CEO can't just have the tone from the top. They have to have the code, the commitment, and the action from the top. I also, and I don't know if any of you haven't seen it, take a look at the Department of Justice's good compliance program points that just came out, I think, in November of last year. I submitted them, but just look up DOJ compliance program. That document came out right after the election. And it kind of came out unceremoniously. There was no cover memo on it. It just went up on the internet. I think that was one of your beg for forgiveness. It was created by the fraud division at DOJ with the help of the head of compliance for DOJ and their pointers on what makes a good compliance program. And I can tell you, because I go in for interviews for monitorships, and one of them on there was about the code of conduct training. So the question that I had asked DOJ is, we were looking at a company, and I said, so does the CEO take that code training, or does his secretary? They started laughing. That is now a constant question. When you go in, if your company goes into DOJ, they're going to ask that question, and actually they'll probably go to the secretaries, or now we call them assistants, to ask them. Literally, those are hard examples of what will give you a good indicator of a compliance program. And the other thing, too, is you don't have to have a big compliance program, but you have to have everybody join into the compliance program. So the final points that I will make, tone from the top, nice, but actions speak louder than words. There are 2 companies that have recently announced monitorships. I looked at their code of conduct and I said, where's the CEO's face? Where is he saying that? And I was told by the company, and it's healthcare industry, and they said, oh, that would be a joke if he did that. Nobody would ever believe him. I said, well, you got to at least make the effort to show that you're going to have your CEO care about it. Conduct from the middle. Your middle management, that is where the rubber meets the road. You can have everybody up top saying everything, and you can have your people down below, like Volkswagen. Their people down below were complaining that there were problems in the company, and guess what? They were disloyal. They got fired. And so now Volkswagen has to implement a whistleblower policy, which is foreign to Germany, but they have to do that to encourage people to speak up. When you see a problem, speak up. It might not be intentional. It might be an unintended consequence. Speak up. And again, conduct from the bottom. LaSalle said something really great where they recognize and acknowledge their employees that did good compliance. Hey, there are some companies where at the end of the year, you get a score. It's either a +1 or a -1. If you get a +1 for compliance, you get a 10% bonus. If you get a -1, guess what? You don't get a bonus. And actually, you might lose money in your salary. So you have to acknowledge and recognize it if that's what you want to do. And frankly, everybody needs to take the code of conduct training. Compliance is not static, everybody. Compliance has to change. It has to ebb and flow. I can't tell you how industries have changed just in the last 5 years. And I can tell you this because companies come to us now before they're in trouble, but they're concerned because they know that their industry is being looked at. And they come and ask us to come look at kick the tires, tell us if we're doing something right or something wrong. And I cannot tell you how many companies will come in and say, okay, can you look at FCP? Could you go ahead and look at the anti-bribery? Could you then take a look at my code? And I said, whoa. Let's start with a risk-based assessment. What are you worried about most? And then let's take a piece of that. Because if I can identify all the problems, that's easy. We got to come up with a plan to fix it. Because if you get caught along the way, or a regulator comes in to examine it, and you say, got it, I knew it was a problem. Well, what'd you do with it? Well, there are all these problems, and it's documented. Document a problem, come up with a plan. We're going to hit this one next year, this one next year, this one next year. You will not be faulted. Actually, you heard from Ms. Coakley, they will take that into account. The Securities and Exchange Commission will take that into account. The FTC will take that into account, so long as you don't get constantly reminded because you keep doing something wrong. And then, again, does your CEO encourage training and lead training? It can't be, it's another annual training. Make it short. Doesn't have to be long, but it shouldn't be like you have to take some bad medicine. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I've worked in every industry, so I just took the education because that's where I was a chief compliance officer. But there are lots of different, any industry. I've been in almost all of them, certainly to give advice. Yes, please.
Hi.
Hi.
When you are in a world where you're constantly in a reactive state, how do you find that bridge to go to proactive?
Okay, so we were in a reactive state. And what you have to do, and this is where and this is not my pitch for Perform Line, but I'm going to tell you, this is where the technology helps. If you can find your data so that you're collecting it as you're reacting. You're fixing it as you're reacting, but at some point you're going to get over the point where you'll be able to have indicators. You should be able to do proactive identification of issues that may come up and figure out ways to fix them. You have to be very disciplined to do it. And I remember when I said when we were trying to do the settlement, we had work streams. Every day, everybody in the company was working on a work stream. Not all day long. It was like a 2-hour stint, and you had to be persistent and relentless. But you also need backing of your leadership in the company. If you don't, and you're sitting there, and as a compliance officer, trust me, compliance officers lately have been getting arrested, going to jail, then you get out. But I do think that what you have to do is be reactive, but constantly thinking, okay, what was the root cause of that? Why did we get there? I will also tell you this, a lot of the stuff's cyclical. it's not going to be so unique that you've never seen it before. And the other thing too is I talk to other people in my industry. I don't know why people think, oh my God, it's just me. Find some colleagues in the industry that you can share these examples with, and ask them what they're doing. There's a lot of great information out there. Nobody has the the silver bullet to figure out how to resolve everything, but there are ways to do it. But using any kind of automated system to help your compliance people do their jobs better and faster. Okay, thank you very much. Have a great. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am.
Thank you. What would be the method of establishing some codes of conduct if you don't have any?
Okay. Let me just say this. I have read, I just read something yesterday, of a very small startup company. They had the most detailed record destruction thing. And I'm looking at it and I realize they must have picked it up from somewhere. So I can tell you this. The internet is a wonderful thing. Every company seems to have their code of conduct. Use them as a guidance. But I've read for one industry, I was looking at something and I'm reading it and I go, whoa, this is not financial, this is the healthcare industry. Tailor it. But there's information out there. Make it real, make it relevant to your company. Don't make it that it has to look so pretty on the shelf. Make it useful and helpful. And go sit with your operators. I mean, I will tell you this, I can never go into a company without talking to the business side. I sat with my CFO when I first started the company and I said, you tell me where we're making money. And he'd show me and I'd go, let me show you where we have problems. Incentivization. So I'd really talk to the operators, find out what makes them make money, and then you figure out what gets people in trouble, and then you'll be able to find a path. And ask them. That's their biggest thing. It's like, oh, compliance, what do they know? They're like Dr. No. No, tell me how you want me to get there, and let's work together. But there's a lot of great information out there. I mean, nobody has a perfect code of conduct. You just have to have perfect people so that they follow the code of conduct. Okay. Thanks, everybody.